Zara's body shuddered as she stumbled through the dark, jagged terrain, her energy reserves nearly depleted. The cold, toxic air of the planet seared her lungs with every breath, each step a laborious effort. Her skin, once a vibrant shade of violet, was now pale and flickering dimly in the dim light, the bioluminescent patterns across her arms fading with her life force. The crash had been a disaster. She had barely survived the impact when her ship had broken apart, scattering debris across the barren landscape. With her communications dead, no distress signal had gone out. She was alone. The planet's hostile environment only added to her peril. The atmosphere was thin, toxic, and unbreathable for her species, which meant that her survival depended entirely on the technology of her ship's emergency systems. But now, with her ship destroyed and no hope of assistance, Zara had been reduced to a wounded animal in a vast and merciless world. Every instinct screamed at her to keep moving, but the constant pain in her side was relentless. A sharp, burning sensation raced through her chest as her internal injury pulsed with each uneven breath. She had tried to use her personal med pack, but it was inadequate for the kind of damage she'd sustained. There was nothing she could do now except find shelter, and pray that the creatures lurking in the dark wouldn't find her. The first time she had heard the creatures was during the night. The eerie, clicking noises that echoed across the barren landscape sent shivers down her spine. Rhinops, she knew. She had read about them in her training data. Towering insectoid predators with armored exoskeletons capable of withstanding most conventional weapons. Their enormous mandibles and clawed legs made them terrifying opponents, and the fact that they hunted in packs made them nearly impossible to avoid. The creatures had likely smelled her blood or sensed her weakness, and were closing in. Zara's only hope was to reach the small cave system she had detected earlier on her thermal scanner. It wasn't much, but it would offer some form of shelter from the predators. If she could get there, she might be able to last long enough to make it through the night. Her limbs felt like lead, and every step was a struggle. Her vision blurred at the edges, her energy flickering like a dying star. It would only take a few more minutes before she couldn't keep moving at all. Suddenly, she froze. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as she sensed something approaching, something large. Her enhanced senses, though dulled by exhaustion, could still pick up the vibrations in the air, the unmistakable hum of something alive. The rhinops. Her heart raced and adrenaline surged through her, pushing her to keep moving. She couldn't let them catch her. She couldn't let them find her like this, weak and helpless. Yet, every time she tried to push forward, her body betrayed her. Her vision flickered, the world spinning in and out of focus. The edges of her consciousness were fraying. She stumbled, falling to one knee, her hands scraping against the rough ground as she tried to regain her balance. The cave was still 100 meters away, but it might as well have been 1,000. She would never make it. The creatures were drawing closer, their clicking and hissing growing louder. Zara felt the tremors in the ground as they advanced. Her body was on the edge, her consciousness flickering. She couldn't run anymore. The first of the rhinops appeared, its massive form casting a shadow over her. It stood nearly 5 meters tall, its exoskeleton glistening in the dim light. Its eyes, multifaceted and unblinking, glowed an eerie red. The rhinop's sharp, clawed legs scraped against the rock as it lowered its head, sniffing the air. It could smell her, the blood staining her skin, the weakness that radiated from her every movement. It was circling, calculating its next strike. Zara's breath hitched as panic surged through her. She reached for her plasma blade, but her hands were too weak to grip it properly. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the weapon, but her strength failed her. She couldn't hold on to it. It fell from her grasp, clattering against the ground, useless. The rhinoc stepped forward, its huge mandibles clicking open and close, its tongue flicking out, tasting the air. It was preparing to strike. Zara could feel the darkness closing in, her vision narrowing to a pinprick of light. She had failed. She had fought, survived the crash, and fought the pain, but in the end, it hadn't mattered. She was going to die here alone on a world that was not her own. Then, a strange sound pierced the air, a low hum, followed by a loud mechanical whine. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating, but the sound was real. The Rhinoff hissed, its attention momentarily diverted. A bright flash of light cut through the darkness, and something exploded, something powerful enough to make the Rhinoff pause. It recoiled, its eyes wide in surprise as the energy wave slammed into the ground near it, sending a shockwave that sent dirt and debris flying. Before Zara could even process what was happening, there was another burst of light, this one accompanied by a loud roar. The ground trembled, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she saw the shadow of something large moving against the stormy sky. Something that wasn't a Rhinoff. The creature shrieked, and then there was a sound she couldn't quite place, a human shout, a voice commanding. Her fading consciousness couldn't process the words, but the sensation that followed was unmistakable. Help. Someone had come. She wasn't alone. The Rhinoffs, sensing a new threat, began to scatter, their clicking noises fading into the distance. And then silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Zara's vision dimmed further, and she slumped forward, finally losing the battle against her failing body. But before everything went black, she felt something, a gentle touch, a strange warmth that wasn't the cold, unforgiving wind of the planet. A voice, distant yet clear, spoke to her. You're safe now. The world around Alex Ward was a harsh, desolate expanse of rock and dust. His exosuit hummed with life, the sophisticated systems within monitoring every movement, every shift in the atmosphere. He was scanning for survivors or threats. His mission had initially been simple: track down the rogue mercenaries who had crashed on this forsaken planet, retrieve any stolen tech, and leave. But things had spiraled quickly. The wreckage of their ship, the violent storms, the monstrous creatures prowling the landscape. It was a mess. And now, in the midst of all this chaos, he was hunting a signal, one that wasn't supposed to be there. His shuttle drifted silently above the jagged, rocky cliffs, sensors pinging as they swept across the land. He wasn't supposed to find any more survivors. But when the distress signal had reached him, an unidentifiable, faint signal cut off in the middle of transmission, he knew he couldn't ignore it. This was someone, not just static, someone in danger. The planet's surface had been mostly unexplored by humans until recently, but it had never been considered particularly dangerous. At least, not until these recent storms had been discovered. The creatures that roamed the terrain, the Rhinoffs, were something else entirely. Monstrous predators that seemed to thrive in the desolation. The information on them was minimal, pieced together from scans of previous explorers who had gotten too close and never returned. The shuttle descended, cutting through the thick storm clouds that clung to the surface like a living thing. Alex's HUD blinked, showing a faint heat signature near the edge of a rocky gorge. It was weak, the signature barely registering against the overwhelming natural heat of the planet. But it was there. His heart raced, fingers instinctively moving to adjust the shuttle's weapon systems. Rhinoffs were territorial and aggressive, and if this was an injured person or creature, it was likely that the Rhinoffs were already closing in. He couldn't afford to be careless. The shuttle touched down softly, its landing pad sinking into the dust as the storm's howling winds battered the hull. Alex didn't wait. With a practiced motion, he triggered the release of his exosuit's landing gear and sealed the shuttle door. As he stepped into the howling wind, the air stung against the exposed parts of his suit, but it didn't matter. His sensors were already locking onto the faint heat signature again. It was moving. Stay sharp, he muttered to himself, his voice muffled inside his helmet. The external display showed the thermal readouts of the immediate area, highlighting the area where the heat signature had moved, cutting through the storm and the debris. It was small, perhaps a humanoid, or something close. He moved quickly, scanning the rocky terrain ahead. His plasma rifle was slung across his back, ready for anything. But it wasn't the monsters he was concerned about now. Whoever was out here had to be in bad shape to still be alive. The signal had been faint, a barely detectable blip in a sea of static, and that was a worrying sign. Either they were gravely injured, or they weren't human. As he rounded a corner in the jagged rock, the faint glow of bioluminescence caught his eye, a weak, flickering light. He stopped in his tracks, eyes narrowing behind the visor. That wasn't just any light. It was alien. The figure ahead was slumped against a large rock, her body weakly twitching in the wind. At first glance, Alex could see she was far from human. The skin, a pale shade of violet, seemed to glow in the darkness, though not as brightly as it should. Her forearms were folded tightly across her body, as if she was trying to preserve what little energy she had left. A deep gash ran across her side, and blood, a glowing greenish fluid, was seeping from the wound, staining the dirt below. The rhinots were closing in. Alex's heart skipped a beat. She was alive, barely, but alive. That was something. Without hesitation, Alex reached for his rifle, scanning the area for movement. The rhinots were drawn to her scent, her weakness. But he wasn't about to let them have their prey. The first rhinoth appeared from the mist, a hulking shadow with its insectoid legs moving quickly across the rocky terrain. Its massive, predatory eyes locked onto the alien girl as it advanced. Another followed, then another, the creatures moving in as though they could sense the moment of vulnerability. Alex didn't hesitate. His rifle roared to life, firing a burst of concentrated plasma that exploded against the first rhinoth's exoskeleton. The creature let out a high-pitched screech, recoiling from the blast but not retreating. Alex fired again, hitting it in the chest, sending it skidding back. But more were coming. The second rhinoth lunged, its mandibles snapping open and closed, hungry for blood. Alex dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its strike, and fired at the creature's legs. The plasma burst caught one of its joints, and the rhinoth stumbled, temporarily disabled but still dangerous. With another flick of his wrist, Alex triggered the shuttle's secondary weapon system, sending a blast of energy that struck the ground between the rhinots. The shockwave sent the monster scattering, momentarily stunned by the blast force. "Get up!" Alex shouted through his comms, his voice rough with urgency. The alien girl was still slumped against the rock, her body shaking uncontrollably, and the creatures weren't backing off. He ran to her, crouching beside her, and gently nudged her with his arm. "Come on, we don't have much time." She didn't respond at first, her head drooping as if she were about to pass out. Her eyes, however, were wide and alert, though they lacked focus. She was too weak to fight back. "Listen to me," Alex said, his voice softer now. "You need to get up. You're not safe here." His eyes scanned the horizon. The other rhinots were regrouping, clearly more intelligent than he'd hoped. It was then that he saw it. Her eyes shifted toward him, her expression pained but somehow understanding. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her forearms shaking as they tried to find stability. Alex extended a hand to her, ready to help. She didn't take it, instead pushing herself up on her own. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to assess whether he was friend or foe. Finally, her lips parted and she spoke. The words were garbled, the language alien to his ears, but the tone was desperate. There was a connection, however tenuous, in that moment, a mutual understanding. She needed help. He was offering it. Alex didn't waste time. He gestured toward the shuttle, turning on his heel and moving toward it, beckoning her to follow. "We don't have a lot of time. We need to move now." The alien girl staggered after him, her steps unsteady but determined. The rhinots were closing in again, but Alex had bought them a few precious seconds. "Stay close," he muttered, raising his rifle again, scanning the dark horizon for the next wave. And for the first time, he wasn't just on a mission to survive. He was fighting for someone else's life. The shuttle's engines hummed with life as Alex piloted it through the thick, toxic clouds, leaving the dangers of the planet's surface behind. The wind and storm outside raged fiercely, but inside the shuttle, it was calm, cold, sterile, and efficient. Alex's mind was racing. He had rescued the alien girl barely, and now they were both heading for relative safety, if you could call it that. The larger fleet would be their next stop, but there were questions in the air. Who was she? What was she doing here? Why had she been left to die on that forsaken planet? And what would happen once they reached the fleet? Alex glanced over at her. She was still slumped in the seat across from him, her body shaking with the effort to stay awake. Her bioluminescent skin flickered, her energy reserves almost completely depleted. He had patched up the worst of her wounds, using his own medical supplies. The deep gash on her side had been the most pressing concern, but the creature's claws had done more than just physical damage. It had punctured something vital in her body, and the healing process was taking longer than it should. She was a mystery. Her species was clearly not human, but he had never encountered anything like her before. For arms, bioluminescent skin, and a fragile but resilient physiology that seemed almost otherworldly. He had scanned her vitals earlier, and what he had found was troubling. Her body's energy system was completely different from anything he had seen. She was not just alien. She was alien in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Her species must have evolved differently from anything Alex had studied, and it left him with more questions than answers. Still, she was alive, and that was the important part. For now, that would have to be enough. The hum of the shuttle's engines grew louder as they neared the safety of orbit. Alex tapped a few buttons on his console, ensuring the autopilot was locked in and that they were headed for the rendezvous point with the human fleet. As the shuttle ascended into the upper atmosphere, the view outside shifted. The storm clouds thinned, and the rocky surface of the planet below became a blurry smear in the distance. The alien girl stirred, her eyes flickering open. Alex met her gaze, and though she couldn't understand his language, the confusion in her eyes was clear. She was fighting to stay conscious, struggling with the effects of her injuries and the strange environment. He glanced at the small data pad beside him, checking the medical scanner once again. Her vitals were stabilizing, but just barely. She was still unconscious, and her body seemed to be in shock. But she was alive, barely, but alive. Alex took a deep breath, watching her. She was an enigma, someone from another world, literally, and he didn't know what to make of it. He'd been trained for situations like this, to make snap decisions in life-or-death moments. But this was something different. This wasn't a military mission. It was a rescue, and rescues didn't come with answers. They just came with questions. Her eyes blinked again, more focused this time. Slowly, she sat up, her body trembling as she pushed herself to her feet. She winced, her face contorting in pain, but she steadied herself, looking around at the interior of the shuttle with wide eyes. For a moment, Alex wondered if she even knew where she was, or if she had just accepted that whatever was happening was beyond her understanding. "You're safe," Alex said softly, his voice muffled through the helmet. She didn't respond, just stared at him with an intensity that was both unnerving and fascinating. Despite everything, he had a sense that she was incredibly intelligent enough to understand what he was trying to say, even if she didn't speak the same language. He turned his attention back to the controls, guiding the shuttle smoothly through the atmosphere. His mind wandered back to the chaos on the ground. The Rhinos had been relentless, but Alex had done what he needed to. The shuttle had been his lifeline, and it had saved them both. But that didn't change the fact that they had barely escaped. After a few minutes of silence, the alien girl finally spoke, her voice weak and strained. The words were incomprehensible to Alex, but there was a softness to them. She was trying to communicate, trying to make him understand something important. Her eyes were full of emotion, and for a moment, Alex couldn't help but feel a twinge of empathy for her. Whatever her story was, whatever had brought her to this desolate world, she was just as much a victim of fate as he was. "I know you're trying to tell me something," Alex said, keeping his tone steady. He didn't know if she understood him, but it was all he could offer. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." The alien girl stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then her trembling hands reached up to her head, her fingers brushing against the strange patterns on her skin, her bioluminescent markings flickering weakly. She winced in pain, but then, with surprising strength, she began to form a sound that wasn't quite words, but not entirely nonsensical either. Alex leaned forward slightly, focusing on her. It was clear she was struggling, fighting to communicate despite the language barrier. She paused, and then tried again, her words more distinct, though still alien to him. "Zara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Zara from Zyron. The name sent a ripple through Alex. Zyron. He had heard the name before, though not in a context that was particularly useful. It was the name of a distant unknown planet, one that few humans had ever set foot on. But hearing it now, from the alien girl's lips, made it real. She wasn't just some random survivor. She was from a world that wasn't supposed to exist, at least not for humans. Zyron, Alex repeated quietly, more to himself than to her. It sounded foreign, yet familiar. You're from a whole other world, aren't you?" She nodded weakly, her eyes filled with sadness and a strange sense of loss. As she spoke, her words became more fragmented, but Alex could understand the emotion behind them. "Mission crash survival alone," she murmured, her voice trembling with each word. "Help need help." Her plea was simple, and yet it carried the weight of everything that had led her to this point. She had been stranded, alone, fighting for survival on a planet full of monstrous creatures, and only now, through sheer will and luck, had she been rescued. "I'm here to help," Alex said softly, his voice steady as he turned his attention back to the controls. The shuttle was now clear of the storm, and he was heading toward a rendezvous with the human fleet, where he could get Zara the medical help she needed. She wasn't safe yet, but for the first time since he had discovered her on that hellish planet, there was a sense of hope. The ship's comm system beeped, signaling that they were nearing the fleet's coordinates. Alex activated the system, letting the connection establish with the nearby ships. A voice crackled through the comms. "Commander Ward, this is Fleet Command. Do you have the asset?" Alex's response was simple. "I do, and she's in bad shape. Get ready to receive her." Zara's eyes met his once more. There was a flicker of recognition in them, a silent understanding. Whatever happened next, she was no longer alone. They were headed to a place of safety, his people's safety, and though her future was uncertain, she had a chance. The shuttle pushed forward, the stars ahead now more clear and infinite than ever.